Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another AAP Environmental Screencast with your AAP Environmental Science teacher, Mr. Stano. And today we're going to move into some more ecology or community ecology, looking at the interactions of species with other species within communities. When we first look at any sort of community, we need to look at the structure of it itself, because the structure of the community of that area will really determine kind of how it's utilized and really the interactions that may play a part in it. So biological communities, they're different in their structure. If we take a look here, we can see that this shortgrass prairie right here does not have really any vertical structure to it at all. So what we're going to see here is mostly play right at the surface, and then of course going down deep and below the surface. As we move into, say, something like a tropical rainforest, we get this huge vertical structure here. So we can have different niches all the way up to the top, including the canopy itself, and then of course going down underneath that ground level. So that vertical structure just opens up many new possibilities for interactions and different lifestyles. So species diversity in this structure, like we said, different species playing different roles. Biological communities are different in the types and number of species they contain and the ecological roles that the species play. They're in different niches. We can look at species diversity by looking at the species richness and the evenness. The species richness is basically just the number of different species it contains, and the evenness is basically the number or the population size of each of those species. So we combine those two and we can get species diversity. There's actually an index called the Shannon-Werner Diversity Index that we'll be using in class that will kind of put a number, a unitless number to species diversity, so you can actually compare one area to another. The number itself, though, without anything to compare, really does not mean much at all. The structure itself, or the niche structure, is just going to be the potential for ecological niches to occur, how they resemble or differ, and the species occupying those different niches interact. Geographic location. Species diversity is the highest in the tropics and declines as we move from the equator towards the poles, which would kind of make sense. At the equator, we have a huge amount of sunlight coming in, so it's a huge source of energy that we can that our producers can use and supply and move up into different trophic levels. Versus as we go towards the poles, it's less and less, and it's very seasonal, that amount of sunlight that we have. Climate's going to play a big role in all this. There's many different types of species, but we can basically break them down into about 4 or 5. We have native species in the area, non-native or invasive species, exotic species sometimes they're called, indicator species, keystone, and foundation species. And they all have different roles within a community. Native species, these are just organisms that normally live and thrive in a particular community. So here, Long Island, pretty much a deer is considered native species. Gray squirrel is also considered native species here. Non-native species, those that migrate into an area or deliberately or accidentally introduced into a community. So remember on the EPOD that I had a few days back where we talked about the earthworms, how the earthworms that are here now are actually a European or Asian variety of earthworm, and that the last glacial advance and retreat wiped out the native earthworms in the area. One thing we can look at is MacArthur and Wilson proposed the island of biogeography theory in the 1960s, basically to look at immigration and extinction rates from an island based on the island's size and the distance to the nearest mainland. So if it's really far from the mainland, you won't have much immigration onto the island. Also, island size will allow for more niches, so you're also going to have different organisms occupying those different roles. And we can look at there's an equilibrium based on those two parameters. The first type of species that we're going to be looking at is our indicator species, also known as biological smoke alarms. These basically react to changes in the environment sooner or before other species do. It's just really any change. So trout species are extremely sensitive to oxygen levels. So if we see a change in oxygen levels within the water, such as a decrease, trout species are either going to try to migrate into a different area, or they may die off. We can see many bird species also will act as indicator species too by moving in into and out of different areas. Frogs or amphibians are another great indicator species, extremely sensitive to a lot of different environmental factors. Any sort of chemicals, definitely. Climate change also, once again, they're extremely sensitive to. So what we see is anytime we have some sort of extreme drought, we're going to see a decrease in our amphibian species. Pollution is a huge indicator, or actually has a huge effect on our amphibian species. That exchange of gases that they have through their skin also just opens it up for any sort of chemical to move into and out into their skin. Any increase in ultraviolet radiation. Parasites, we see a number of different fungal diseases that are associated with amphibians that are wiping them out. Hunting in some areas, and just natural immigration of other species coming in, pushing or outcompeting those amphibians. Then we have keystone species. Keystone species basically kind of determine the shape of the community and the other numbers of species in it. So the sea otter that we have here feeds extensively on sea stars, and also it feeds on also in sea urchins. And by feeding on the sea urchins, it'll actually help control or help allow the kelp population to grow, and then the kelp population, if that seaweed grows bigger, now it opens up areas for smaller fish, bait fish to hide into. If we don't, those sea urchins will actually eat the kelp and then kind of decrease the habitat for other fish to come in and hide, and it just kind of dominoes that way. So the sea otter basically plays an important role in maintaining that sea urchin population. Then we have foundation species. So foundation species, what they do is they'll actually open up new niches. They'll open up new habitat for other organisms to come on in. So elephants, for example, when they push over, uproot, or break a tree, now what they do is that it'll allow sunlight to come into an area so new species can grow into that region. But then also that decaying log or that tree will now allow for new species to come in there, new host of decomposers to come in. We can look at some interactions with the species themselves. So they can be competition, species competing for same resources or a series of same resources. Predation, one feeding another. Parasitism, an organism that basically takes hold of another organism at the loss of the other one. Mutualism, where they kind of both benefit, and then commensalism, where one organism benefits and the other one doesn't. Sometimes we look at them as win-win or win-lose situations, and as we go through them, I'll explain them that way. Some species co-evolve adaptations that allow them to reduce or to avoid competition altogether, which is known as resource partitioning, which we mentioned in class the other day. So resource partitioning, basically what it does is it allows organisms to kind of live within close proximity of it, but utilize resources in different ways or at different times to avoid any sort of competition. So here we see with this bird with these species of bird, that they're going through the spruce tree at different heights, or because of the vertical structure of it, and able in turn to eat different insects, and sometimes at different times, and all manage to live at the same time. And we have niche specialization. So once again, we can look at the resource use of these niches. And where we have that overlap is going to be competition. So what species can evolve to do over time, once again, not knowingly, it just happens, is they can actually move or make use of that realized niche and actually avoid any sort of competition. So that fundamental niche, remember, it will be this full width of it, but the realized is what they're actually making use of. And by doing that, just using that realized niche, they avoid any competition or have very little competition for whatever resources that's in common between the two. Species, when we're looking at competition and predation, species called predators feed on others called prey. I think we learned about this pretty early on. And they use their senses to either locate objects and prey or to attract pollinators and mates. And it works in a number of different ways. Some predators are fast enough to catch their prey. Sometimes they hide or ambush their prey. Sometimes they use chemicals to do it. The number of abilities that predators have to catch prey is pretty enormous. But then at the same token, prey have an equally sometimes armed defense also against for a lot of these predators. So predation here is some different types of organisms here, and some use and some prey will use that we're looking at here may be camouflaged, or may develop over time to look like other organisms, like these two on the bottom, like the caterpillar and the moth. So the moth will open up its wings to reveal these dark spots to possibly look like an owl, scare away, or make it look bigger than what it really is. This caterpillar, when touched, the back end will inflame up to look like a snake. Chemicals right here to basically make it to not appealing to a lot of organisms, or foul tasting like the monarch butterfly. So just a number of different defenses I have, and we'll go over some of these in class. Parasitism, when we're looking at that, occurs when one species feeds on part of another organism. So we'll be a few very good examples in class, but one parasite here on Long Island, we have the tick, the deer tick, and also Lone Star tick is coming into play here, and it's all to benefit themselves. They'll come in, they'll feed on their hosts, and kind of whatever happens to them happens to them. In mutualism, two species interact in a way that benefits both, known as a win-win situation. And the commensalism is interaction that benefits one species but has little of any effect on the other species. We see this with different types of bacteria in our gut, and this that can move through that way. And we see it with a number of different organisms too, where they're around in us, but we have yet to discover any effect that it has on us. So parasites, once again, can harm their hosts and promote community biodiversity. They live in the host. Microorganisms, tapeworms, they sometimes live outside, fleas and ticks like I mentioned before, and some have little contact with the host. Dump nesting birds like the cowbird has got a nice little trick. What it'll do is it'll wait for bird usually to lay a clutch of eggs. The cowbird will come in, push some of those eggs out, and then lay its own and leave. Sometimes I think we see these with cardinals. They'll do it with pretty often also. So here's some mutualistic relationships that we have here. The oxpeckers and the black rhinoceros right here. Basically, these, the rhinoceros basically provides a little place for them to hang out. Also, they'll come along, pick any insects that may be on it, so the food, and helps keep that rhinoceros clean. The fungi on seedlings also help providing nutrients for them, and then in return those junipers are going to be providing some carbohydrates for them also, and just a place to be. We also see this with the rhizobium on legume plants too, the same type of mutualistic relationship. We see that a lot with some sort of microorganism and plant species. Commensalism, like I said, once again, using without harm. A little bit touchy on this area. Sometimes we're not exactly sure if it's commensalistic or not. And we'll go over some solid cases in class. So we'll stop here with looking at the different species and how they interact with each other. And then next time we come back, we'll look at ecological succession, and we'll move a little bit further into ecology. Hope you enjoyed this screencast. Take care.